the seventh Prime Minister under Emmanuel Macron and the shortest ever serving Prime Minister in the history of the Fifth Republic, just 27 days in office. So what went wrong? Why did he quit? Well, listening to him there, he basically seems to suggest that what he was working with was totally unworkable.
France is once again facing a wave of political uncertainty. Only a month after being appointed, Prime Minister Sébastien Lecornu has resigned, marking another chapter of turmoil in President Emmanuel Macron's government. The resignation, submitted early this morning and immediately accepted by Macron, came just hours after Lecornu announced his new cabinet lineup, one that was meant to symbolize stability, but instead exposed deep cracks within the French political landscape. When Lecornu first took office, he promised a new direction for France, a clear break from the gridlock that had paralyzed Macron's administration for months. He spoke about renewal, accountability, and a government that would finally deliver results to a population weary of economic pressures and political infighting.
And a top focus this hour is the big story that we're tracking from France. The country's newly appointed Prime Minister, Sébastien Lecornu, has resigned.
But less than 30 days later, those words have vanished into thin air. France finds itself without a prime minister, without a functioning cabinet, and with mounting questions about where the presidency can possibly go next. For President Macron, this resignation is not just another political hiccup. It is a direct challenge to his authority and strategy. The president, now midway through his second term, has struggled to maintain control over a fragmented National Assembly. His centrist party no longer commands a majority, and every decision now depends on fragile alliances with rival blocs. Lecornu was supposed to be the figure who could hold those alliances together, a loyal Macronist with enough credibility to appeal to conservatives in the Republican Party. But instead, he became the latest casualty of France's deepening parliamentary chaos. The drama unfolded rapidly. Late last night, Lecornu unveiled his cabinet, a list filled with familiar faces, many of them holdovers from previous administrations. What was meant to signal continuity was instead read as stagnation. Critics immediately pointed out that despite promises of renewal, Macron's government looked almost identical to those that had already failed. Within hours, dissent began to grow inside the very coalition Lecornu hoped to strengthen. By midnight, the leader of the Republican Party, Bruno Retailleau, issued a veiled threat to withdraw his party's cooperation. Republicans, who had been courted heavily by Macron's team, accused the president of taking their support for granted while offering them little real power. They wanted more than token cabinet positions. They wanted a genuine share of decision-making authority. Without them, Macron's government would have no hope of passing legislation in the divided parliament. When Lecornu woke up this morning, the writing was already on the wall. Instead of preparing for his first cabinet meeting, he went directly to the Élysée Palace. There, he handed in his resignation to President Macron, who accepted it immediately. The shock waves were felt across Paris. Markets dipped by more than 2% at the opening bell, signaling investor anxiety over France's growing political vacuum. The situation has left many in France wondering what went wrong so quickly. Analysts suggest Lecornu faced an impossible task from the beginning. The government's parliamentary weakness meant he could not pass laws without reaching across party lines. Yet his own base resisted any deep compromises. He had promised to govern without invoking Article 49.3, a controversial constitutional mechanism that allows the government to pass laws without a vote in Parliament. That pledge, though noble, effectively tied his hands. In a chamber divided between left, right, and far-right blocs, building consensus was nearly impossible. French political commentator Marc Perelman, speaking to France 24, described the collapse as a disaster of improvisation. He noted that Lecornu had spent weeks in silence, presumably negotiating alliances and preparing a government program, but the result suggested the opposite. There was no preparation, Perelman said. After weeks of waiting, France got a half-baked cabinet and a prime minister who lost control of his coalition before even addressing parliament. Indeed, Lecornu never got the chance to present his government's plan to lawmakers. His speech to the National Assembly, scheduled for tomorrow, has now been cancelled. The cabinet meeting that was supposed to take place this afternoon has also been scrapped. The resignation leaves France in a kind of political limbo, with no clear leader and no functioning administration. The timing could not be worse. France is struggling to balance its budget amid rising debt, inflation, and pressure from the European Union to rein in spending. The country is also facing social unrest, with unions and citizens preparing new rounds of protests against cost-of-living increases and pension reforms. Internationally, Macron's influence in Europe has waned, and domestic instability only further weakens his position as one of the EU's leading voices. The Republican Party's role in this crisis cannot be understated. Over the past year, Macron has tried repeatedly to bring them into his governing alliance. His strategy was to build a centrist conservative coalition broad enough to overcome the fractured parliament. The Republicans, though smaller in number, were essential to reaching a working majority. But their patience has run thin. They accuse Macron of using them for votes without truly sharing power. Lecornu's new cabinet offered them a few symbolic positions, but not the one-third share they had demanded. In their view, this was a betrayal, and the breaking point came quickly. Had Lecornu's government survived another day, the Republican leadership was expected to hold a meeting to decide whether to withdraw completely. His resignation effectively preempted that revolt. Some analysts suggest he resigned to save face before being publicly humiliated. Others argue he had no choice, as continuing without the Republicans would have made his government untenable. As news of the resignation spread, speculation turned immediately to President Macron's next move. By French law, the president holds the authority to appoint a new prime minister, but his options are shrinking fast. His last three appointments, Elisabeth Borne, François Bayrou, and now Sébastien Lecornu, have all failed to hold the government together. Repeating the same formula could invite even greater backlash. Political observers are floating several possible scenarios. One is the creation of a technocratic government, a temporary administration made up of non-political experts tasked with stabilizing the economy and passing a budget before new elections. This model, used in Italy and Greece during past crises, would allow Macron to buy time while avoiding another political battle in Parliament. Another option would be to reach across the aisle and appoint a prime minister from the opposition, perhaps from the Socialist or Green parties. The French left, grouped under the NUPES alliance, has been demanding exactly that. They argue that Macron's centrist experiment has failed and that it is time to give another bloc a chance to govern. Jean-Luc Mélenchon, leader of the far-left France Unbowed, has called for Macron to resign altogether and call fresh presidential elections. The left believes that only a government representing working-class interests can restore stability and trust. Meanwhile, the far-right national rally, led by Marine Le Pen, is waiting in the wings.
France's Prime Minister Sébastien Lecornu has resigned hours after his cabinet was unveiled. The Élysée Palace made the announcement after he met President Emmanuel Macron for an hour earlier this morning. The shock move comes only 26 days after Lecornu was appointed Prime Minister.
Le Pen has taken a more cautious approach, avoiding direct calls for Macron's resignation, but pushing hard for new parliamentary elections. Polls suggest that if a vote were held today, her party could win the largest share of seats, a historic shift that would mark the first time the far right could realistically form a government under France's Fifth Republic. For Macron, this is the nightmare scenario. He has long positioned himself as the centrist bulwark against both extremes, the far left and the far right. But with his political base shrinking and public trust eroding, his ability to keep either side at bay is fading. Calling a snap election could strengthen the national rally's hand, but avoiding one risks prolonging paralysis. Either way, Macron faces one of the toughest decisions of his presidency. As of now, no official announcement has been made about a successor. Lecornu is expected to address the nation from Matignon, the Prime Minister's residence, at 10:45 a.m. Paris time, to explain the reasons behind his resignation. Observers expect him to strike a somber tone, acknowledging his failure to unite the coalition, but perhaps also blaming the structural deadlock of French politics. Meanwhile, markets and European partners are watching closely. France remains the Eurozone's second-largest economy, and instability in Paris could ripple across the continent. Brussels has already expressed concern about France's delayed budget plan, which risks breaching EU deficit limits. A prolonged power vacuum could push France into further economic uncertainty, just as it needs to regain fiscal credibility. Within France, public frustration continues to rise. Many citizens view this latest crisis as proof that political elites are disconnected from the people's everyday struggles. From rising food prices to housing shortages, the issues facing ordinary French families remain unresolved. Protest movements like the Yellow Vests, which shook the nation a few years ago, are quietly gaining new momentum as patience runs out. For now, all eyes are on the Élysée Palace. President Macron must decide whether to double down on his centrist strategy or take the bold step of forming a unity or technocratic government. Either choice carries enormous risk. His next move could determine not just his political survival, but also the direction of France's democracy at a critical moment. As the Voice of Africa audience, it's important to recognize how events in France, a country with deep historical ties to Africa, ripple far beyond Europe. Political instability in Paris can affect everything from trade policies to African development projects and diplomatic relations. France remains a key player across Francophone Africa, and shifts in its domestic politics often influence foreign policy priorities. If Macron's government weakens further, African nations may find themselves dealing with a distracted or reoriented French administration. In the coming days, France's political drama will continue to unfold. Another prime minister may rise, or the nation may head toward another election. What remains certain is that the turbulence in Paris is far from over, and the world, including Africa, is watching closely. Before we end, don't forget to like this video so YouTube recommends it to more viewers. Your support keeps Africa's voice strong and independent. Stay tuned to Voice of Africa for continuing updates on France's evolving political crisis and its impact on global affairs.